in, in other words, as I said, we call this a refutation by logical analogy. Guanillo responded to Anselm's version of the ontological argument by saying, well, listen, couldn't I, by using a parallel argument, conclude that an island in which none greater can be imagined or thought of has to actually be out there, that the most perfect island has to actually exist? And one of the things that Anselm said in reply is that it's not exactly a parallel argument, because talking about the existence of a contingent created thing like an island isn't the same as talking about the existence of a being who is great without qualification, and who exists necessarily. Well, Descartes kind of runs with that. I personally, if you found Anselm's version of this argument a little hard to get a handle on, and honestly, I did the first time I heard it. I honestly did things backwards. I had not studied this in Intro to Philosophy class. We studied other things, but not these, or at least I didn't remember it. And the first time I heard Anselm's argument was after having looked at the 20th century version of it in a formal modal logic course. In other words, I looked at the very technical version of it, which was like its third reincarnation in the 20th century. It reopened the debate, got around Kant's criticisms in the thinking of a number of people. But I really had to think about Anselm's version of it, when I first heard it, in order for it to sort of hit home and see why it was supposed to work. My own feeling is it's easier to understand Descartes' version. I think his is a bit more straightforward. So see what you think. So here's Descartes, and we will see he's trying to use skeptical arguments to see if there's anything he cannot doubt, and we'll look at that later. But at this point in Descartes' reasoning, he's even doubting the existence of the material world. So if he's going to prove the existence of God, he better do it through an a priori argument, because he can't do it using observations from the world, because at that point he's actually doubting the existence of the world using skeptical arguments. And we'll look at this later in the course. So one of the arguments he used, I was telling the last class, I got to get to buildings and grounds, to maintenance, and say, guys, can one of you come over here with a can of 3-in-1 oil or some WD-40 and get these hinges? I mean, these hinges remind me of the creaky doors on old pirate ships or something. It's like, no door in a current classroom should be this noisy to open and close. Anyway, let me go back to this. So Descartes gives us a version of the argument that restates Anselm's, but I think in a clearer way. And both versions, Anselm's and Descartes', make the same logical move that an a priori argument makes. That is, going from the concept of God to a claim that what that concept refers to necessarily exists. Okay, folks, it's louder than you think. All right. Now, I was telling you before, I have had it, not in this class, but in other classes where I let people talk in the back and I didn't pay attention to it. I had people like complain in the front, say, you need to quiet those people down. I can't hear or concentrate, so that's why I'm getting on your case. But are you raising your hand or just okay? You better watch out. It's like going to an auction, right? You're sitting at an auction and you go and scratch your nose, or you raise your hand and suddenly you found you committed yourself to paying $10,000 for a painting you don't want, right? Because oh yeah, I see the bid back there. No, it's just scratching my nose. Yeah, but you put in a bid. All right, folks, let's get back to this. I got to get through this PowerPoint today to keep you all up with the other class. So, we saw that Anselm worked with a concept of God that's consistent with the Judeo-Christian, maybe Islamic view that God is the greatest being we can think of, a being than which none greater can be thought. Descartes works with the concept of God as the supremely perfect being. Now here again, you've got some Platonism built in here. Remember, for Plato, existence and perfection were tied together, that the forms were more perfect than anything in this world, but they also, for Plato, were more fully existing. And so this idea that greatness is and perfection is tied up with existence is one of Plato's assumptions too. So God is portrayed as the being that has all perfect properties. The way it used to be said when I was in grad school is God is the sum of all perfections, has all perfect qualities. And here's what Descartes says about existence and God. Because basically, in response to Guanillo's criticism, Anselm tried to say, look, talking about the existence of God, the necessary existence of God, is different than talking about the contingent existence of something, of a created thing like an island. But now Descartes was a crack mathematician. Anybody take analytic geometry in high school? I don't know how many people did. I went to Poly, and so I did. At any rate,
City Foul.
No, I think you're talking about the Poly City game there. You got it reversed. See, it's not the City Poly game.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, come on now. I gotta get through this thing today here. For some of you who aren't acquainted with this city, that is one of the, maybe the oldest high school rivalry in the whole country. Dates back to the 1880s.
And guess who's been winning? City.
Anyway, okay. So here's Descartes' claim. Descartes was the inventor of analytic geometry. Not of geometry itself, but of analytic geometry, where you synthesize algebra and geometry. And so he's a crack mathematician. So he uses a triangle here. He says, look, existence is so much a part of who God is as the supremely perfect being that you can't separate existence from God any more than you could separate having three sides and three angles from a triangle. In other words, you can't say, Oh, well, I'm thinking of a geometric figure and it's a triangle, but it doesn't have three sides or three angles. You say, well, whatever you're thinking of, it's not a triangle, right? Now, remember also, Aristotle made a distinction between qualities that were essential to what a thing is versus qualities that are just what he called accidents. In other words, look at the triangle here. It's not essential to this being a triangle that it be any particular color, right? Whether it's red or yellow or black. That doesn't matter to its being a triangle, but its essential properties as a triangle are having three sides and three angles that add up to two right angles, to 180 degrees. So we can't separate from a triangle those essential properties of having three sides and three angles. And Descartes is going to try to convince us that we cannot separate from God existence. That is, to talk about God without talking about God as an existing being would be like trying to talk about a triangle without talking about it having three angles. So we can't even think of God except as existing, just as we can't think of a triangle without having three sides and three angles. So why is God's existence so necessarily tied up? Why is existence so necessarily tied up with God's essence? Well, Descartes' answer is because God is the supremely perfect being. And here, when Descartes defines God, you know, if you open some book in theology, you'd get, and you look at a list of God's attributes as in the traditional, say, Judeo-Christian view, you get pretty much what Descartes gives us. So he says the supremely perfect being has all perfections, including existence. Now look at the list on the left here. This is a list of what are commonly called God's attributes or properties. Anybody know what omnipotence means? Well, if say a drug or a medicine is potent, we say it's, you know, powerful, right? Omnipotence means that God is all powerful. Omniscience means God is all knowing. God knows everything. Omnipresence means God is everywhere. And omnibenevolence means God is morally perfect and merciful. Okay.
It relates back to when you're writing an English assignment and you're talking about the person. You say he's omni, which means that he knows all, which means that he's like a third spectrum character, where like he knows what everybody's thinking, and not just himself or somebody else. It's everybody that's inside the book.
Okay, that was, but right, you were trying to
Correlate the
talk about the meaning of the prefix omni.
Yes.
Yeah. You know, all an omnibus goes everywhere. That we talk about buses, but the real word originally was an omnibus, meaning it was something that went everywhere in the city, right? So Descartes would say, if you look at this left-hand description, it's not a complete description of God if we conceive of God as the supremely perfect being, because it lacks a very important property of God, which is existence. So Descartes says if we're going to think of God as a supremely perfect being, we have to put existence into the list of God's attributes. Now, think about this for a second before I move on. If existence is now part of what we mean by the supremely perfect being, could you, as a denier of God, say, well, look, I'll agree with you that if God were around, God would be the supremely perfect being, but I just don't think that God exists. Could you, what would be the problem from Descartes' view of things in saying something like that? Even though it might seem reasonable to say. Well, it goes in line with the way he builds existence into the definition of God as the supremely perfect being. In other words, you can't accept the definition of God as the supremely perfect being and then deny God's existence without contradicting yourself, because you've just bought into God's existence, if Descartes is right, by accepting the concept of God as the supremely perfect being. So this is how the argument goes, right? So he would say, well, so completely does God as the supremely perfect being exist that God can't even be thought of as not existing, just like a triangle can't be thought of without having three sides or three angles. So the denier of God, remember the fool here, he's quoting a verse from the Psalms, the fool has said in his heart there is no God. So here the fool would contradict himself, the denier of God, to on the one hand claim to claim that the supremely perfect being lacks existence, because he's essentially just bought in to God's possessing existence in accepting God as the supremely perfect being. So you can't then go on and deny that God exists without contradicting yourself. So that's how this version is supposed to work. One summary that a text I used to use, and I really should have a citation here, is this: God has all perfections, or all perfect qualities. Existence is a perfection, a perfect quality. Therefore, God possesses existence, or simply, therefore, God exists. You know, that's one way to summarize this version of the argument. Now, again, what I said when I went over Anselm's version is this: it's one thing to either believe or not believe in God. It's another thing entirely to believe that a particular argument that somebody says proves God really does the job. In other words, you can reject an argument as not working without rejecting belief in God altogether. And this is what Immanuel Kant did. For Immanuel Kant, belief in God was necessary toward making any sense at all of things in this messed up world. Right? Because Kant said, look, we have this gut level feeling that if justice is ever going to be done, that the righteous should ultimately be rewarded for their righteousness, and evil should be ultimately punished. But Kant says we know that that doesn't always happen in this world. So Kant says as philosophers, we're rationally justified in thinking, in postulating an existence beyond this life where justice does get done, where the righteous are rewarded and the evil is punished, and we're justified, says Kant, in supposing and postulating the existence of God who's going to pull this off. Now that's Kant's own view, and he was in a German Protestant Lutheran tradition in his own background. So Kant believed in God, but he did not think that Descartes' version of the ontological argument worked. And he has what has come to be known as the stock criticism against it. So Descartes gets this argument out in the late 1600s. Kant criticizes it in the 1900s. What Kant says is Descartes treats existence as what we call a logical predicate. You may have heard people say that this or that is predicated on this or a given assumption. What we mean by a logical predicate, and you've heard that word write a sentence in English has a subject and a predicate, but a logical predicate, it's a narrower definition of the word predicate. Basically, to predicate something of a thing is to say it has a certain property. Like if I say that board over there is white, it's the whiteboard. If I said this chair is blue, or this chair has steel legs, I'm predicating being blue of this chair, or I'm predicating of this chair that it has steel legs. That is, I'm saying it has these various properties. And so what Immanuel Kant says is wrong with Descartes' version of the argument is that it treats existence as a logical predicate, as just another one of God's properties. But Kant says that's not really the way, logically, we should think of existence. And Kant's way of talking about existence is also the way that modern logicians talk about it. He says when we describe a thing, we predicate qualities. And so Descartes has existence functioning as a logical predicate. So what does Kant say? Kant says existence is not the property of a thing. Now, I went for a year and a half without having a car. I do have one now. It's parked out in the parking lot. Now, if somebody said, well, okay, you want me to get something out of your car, you've given me the key, well, describe your car. I said, well, it's a 2007 Mini Cooper. It's green, it exists, it has a black top, it has 4-cylinder engine with a standard transmission. You say, wait a second, Professor Morawski, you said it's green, it exists, and it has a black top. That seems odd. That among the qualities this has, besides having a standard transmission and being green, it also exists. Kant says existence is a condition something needs to fulfill in order to have any properties. In other words, my car has to exist out there on in the parking lot in order to be green or have a four-cylinder engine or an automatic transmission or any of the other properties it has, but existence is not just another property my car has besides being green and having a standard transmission, right? So Kant says, and I basically make the same point in the slide with the car picture there. So a car has to exist in order for it to have any qualities, any properties, right? If my car didn't exist, it wouldn't have any of the properties it has. But existence, again, is not a logical predicate. It's not just another property of a thing, just another quality in the thing's description. So existence in this slide isn't just another property of the sports car here along with being red. So you can say, well, why is that a criticism of Descartes' argument? Well, the argument only goes through if existence is a property in the list. That's what made it contradictory to agree that God is a supremely perfect being and then deny God's existence. That's what forced us in accepting Descartes' version of the argument into accepting God's existence. Let me make this point here. But Kant says, look, we can describe a thing with all of its properties, and it's only after we describe it that we can then, as a separate thing, talk about whether what we just described exists or does not exist. So we describe a thing with all of its properties or qualities, and then afterwards talk about whether it exists or not. But existence is not one of those properties. Yeah, did you?
So basically, if it exists, then it has properties. But just because it has properties doesn't mean that it exists.
Yeah, that's true. In other words, we can describe a thing as having certain properties, but then afterwards, you know, I mean, I can describe Santa Claus, right, and the various properties he has, and then afterwards we can have a discussion about whether, the big fat man with the beard and the red suit actually exists or not. But existence is not a property that Santa Claus has or does not have, right? So here's how we get out of the contradiction. Kant says, if existence is no longer a property in the list, we can then deny God's existence, because when we reject a thing, we reject it with all of its properties. In other words, if I say, look, there isn't any red sports car pictured in this slide, I've rejected the red sports car with all of its properties. I've denied existence to a red sports car in this slide. And consider the triangle again. Kant says, yeah, sure, if I talk about a triangle, Descartes is absolutely right. I can't talk about a triangle without its having three sides and three angles. You know, if we think of a triangle, we have to think of it as having three angles that add up to 180 degrees. But Kant says, look, I can deny existence to the triangle altogether. You know, there's no triangle anymore on this slide. And so I reject it with all of its properties, with all of its sides and angles, and there's no contradiction involved. So you see that Kant, as a believer in God, nonetheless thinks that if somebody denies God's existence, they can do so without contradicting themselves. Descartes notwithstanding. So So essentially, Kant says we can describe God with all of God's qualities, but existence is no longer a list in the list of those qualities, and then afterwards talk about whether God as a being we just described exists or not. And once we take existence out of the list of God's properties, then we can talk about God as a supremely perfect being and whether that being exists or doesn't exist without contradicting ourselves the way Descartes says we would if existence is a property of God. So no contradiction arises in denying God's existence if existence is no longer a quality in God's description. So let me make a point about the contemporary argument. I don't have a marker with me because I traveled light today. But the version of the argument that restarted debate in the 1950s and 60s over this classic argument. In other words, for a while, people thought in the 1900s Kant had dealt the death blow to the ontological argument. He had shown not only that it doesn't work, but why it doesn't work. But then this argument was reformulated in a way that answered Kant's criticisms, because in the contemporary formulation of the argument, existence is not treated as a logical predicate. It's treated exactly as Kant said existence in logic should be treated, because the way Kant talks about it is the way contemporary logic treats it. Suppose the contemporary version talks about God as a necessary being. Or you could say something that's contingent exists in one or more possible worlds, but not in all possible worlds. Something that's logically impossible, like a square circle, can't exist in any possible world. That's the way contemporary logic, modal logic at least, talks about impossibility. Normal logic only talks about whether something can exist or not exist. It doesn't have any room for talking about necessary or possible existence. But modal logic, as an extension of ordinary logic, does. Now, I know if you haven't had logic courses, can go beyond it, but see how much you can follow this. This is the way the contemporary argument goes. You can formulate in modal logic the statement, it is possible that a necessary being, i.e. God, exists. Now think about it. Somebody who denies God's existence might say, well, okay, I don't think God exists. I don't think a necessary being exists. But I'll give you this assumption that it's at least possible that a necessary being exists. I don't know for sure that God does not exist. But from the assumption that it's possible that a necessary being exists, you go in about half a dozen steps to the conclusion that it's necessary that a necessary being exists. In other words, that there's no way that a necessary being cannot exist. Or put another way, in all conceivable worlds, all possible worlds, God must exist. That's what the contemporary argument says, and it's very technical in nature, but it reopened the whole debate over whether the argument may work after all. Because that way of stating the argument does not treat existence as a logical predicate, as a property of a thing. it treats existence in exactly the way Kant said it should be treated, and yet it proves, if it works, that it's absolutely necessary that a necessary being exists in all conceivable possible worlds. Okay, that's the contemporary version. So the first thing we'll do Monday is go over the tests. Look, my midweek is too busy. I need the weekend to finish grading your essays, but that's at the top of my to-do list for the weekend. So we'll see. If any, somebody bring up the roll if anybody missed it. Oh, okay, the roll's up here. If anyone missed it, catch it on the way out.